I'm Shae Russell for mining.com.au, and joining me today is Data Dan Petrie, mining.com.au's head of data. Data Dan, good to see you again. It's been a couple of weeks since we've caught up.
I know, Shay, you've been all around the countryside, and I've been head buried in spreadsheets, and I don't know if my forecasting abilities have improved. I don't think they have. I mean, another week of shock, so to speak, a week of unexpecteds.
It is a week of unexpected, and let's talk about the week that was. Look, this is one of those things. I don't even know how to frame some of these questions. I know many, many years ago when I attempted to be a short term trader, I did actually trade the Trump election and called the absolute wrong direction on gold. But let's go through this because the polls were overwhelmingly predicting a tight race. And
Mm.
we have not been given a tight race. In fact, I'm pretty sure they were able to call a Trump victory early. Dan, where do we start? Do we start with how the data went wrong, or do we start with how everybody misinterpreted the disconnect between Stock Street and, for lack of a better way of putting it, Main Street, like the ordinary people voting in this election?
There's clearly, I think this is an election where I mean, it's already been talked about by some, but um, the fact is that traditional media, heritage media, CNN, CNBC, the New York Times, these kind of big ticket, they don't have the influence they once did. It's the podcasters, it's the tech
Mm.
bros, it's the MMA guys, it's the UFC. It's the Gen X, really, men, that seem to be going, who aren't just white men. They seem to be across all classes who have gone, you know what, we've had enough, and we're sick to death of being characterised, I suppose, as these uneducated morons, for want of a better description. And they listen to Logan Paul, they listen to Joe Rogan, and and who'd have thought long form 3 hour podcast? Now, Donald Trump went on Joe Rogan for 3 hours, no problem. And yeah, like you switch over the networks like a CNBC, a CNN, and you think, and you see the rallies which Kamala Harris was having, you think, there is no way in the world the Republicans are even in this race. But not only in the race, they won, and they won quite convincingly and decisively. And so there's clearly a political message, I suppose, for the people who analyse those things closely. I mean, I think if anything, the money markets were moving quite quickly early in the morning, and then we saw the S&P futures, and to see the Dow Jones up in futures trading 3.5%. I haven't seen that, since like there's the obvious blip of COVID, right? But what would tend to happen is the market would rebound by about 1.5 to 2% tops, 3.5% in a day. And so you're having people who were making in some cases, with fairly modest portfolios, they look in rude health now, all based on sentiment, all based on fundamentals which simply don't make any sense. So it is a week of shocks. It's very, very difficult to see how all this will play out, but effectively the markets seem to like it because they like the pro-business rhetoric. But there's again a massive disconnect to what's happening in the United States. They've got a gigantic debt pile. They're north of 22 trillion odd dollars in debt, US treasuries, a lot of which are owned by the Chinese government, who've got their own problems. And so you've got your major debt holder that owns your debt, and then you want to put a tariff on said debt holder. It's just, if you try to unpack it, you'll get a very sore head very quickly. But the numbers wise, it's I don't like. I think this short term boost with like jump we're seeing in stocks will soon be tempered by the reality of a situation, which is, you can't just do a business deal for what's happening in Ukraine. You just can't annex territory there. You can't go to the Middle East, for example, say we're going to back Israel. I mean, for all intents and purposes, the Israeli army have more than landed a few blows on their enemies, and the Iranians won't, for example, because it all comes back to money, right? The Iranians and Russians are all both in terrible financial shape, worse, much worse than the Americans. And so you have this, what was a short-term jump, then comes reality. And so this honeymoon will end quite quickly, as you get back down to business. So it's an incredibly it's going to be very, very fascinating next 4 years because there's just no certainty with it. That's the thing. The last presidency, he would say, "Tariff man, I'm not doing this anymore," and he was talking about Xi Jinping, and the market would drop 4.5%, 5% the day. Um, just it's an incredibly just a hard area to work in because you just don't know. And to see the gold price come off by 2%, I think that's probably the one asset class I'd be plumping for at the moment, given the fact that seems to be the only constant we know.
So, as somebody who lost trading gold pretty heavily in Donald Trump's first election back in 2015, I'm not surprised to see the metal sell off at all. Actually, I got my ass handed to me back then. I didn't have the time to trade it this time, so I'm not surprised to see gold come off. I think a lot of Trump's presidential win was factored into the gold leading into it. What I don't understand, and
Mm.
I'm hoping you can elaborate on this or at least expand on my thoughts, should Trump's policies get through, they're wildly inflationary.
Yeah.
Um, Trump's known for getting on a podium and words fall out of his mouth, but even for the market to be rallying over really large tariffs, which could actually hurt consumers, how is the stock market getting excited about this? That's what I don't understand.
Well, again, the sentiment's gone out. Like sentiments in, fundamentals are out. I mean, Goldman Sachs is up 13.5% on the day.
Oh,
Now they're getting excited by the fact that they're getting excited by the prospect of a lower corporate tax rate. A more accommodative lending regime. But again, that more accommodative lending regime, of course, which we saw during the Clinton years, and that was Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, we saw what happened with that in terms of the way bonds are packaged up, and that became the stuff of movies and books, and eventually led to what we know as a global financial crisis. But in terms of like the inflationary impact, I mean, if you're to look at US presidents, no matter how powerful they are, you can't sign an executive order just to kind of do away with the Reserve Bank. I mean, you can try. Good luck. But the thing is, the Federal Reserve is an independent authority. Now, if they've got inflation coming down the pipeline, Jerome Powell, for example, is not due to retire till 2026. He can't, and he can't be sacked
mm.
by a president. He said that this morning to journalists. Remember, the Fed cut rates by 0.25% this morning. So 25 basis points has come off. So they've already had yet another run, courtesy of some more money coming in. So 75 basis points in the last 2 months. A president elect coming in talking tariffs. Yet the inflation print in the United States is down 3.2%. So the hard work, for example, and this is not being political, but if you're Joe Biden, you're here going, you know, I took the medicine, 3.2%, we've come down. Now you have actually a policy signal which says we're going for gold, we're going to ramp it up. And again, that's a very, very tough dynamic if you're a central banker. But the thing is, they'll go on the data. And if it looks like they're baking in inflation, interest rates will rise. And that will be a big problem for any president, no matter how bullish they are on the economy.
Shifting gears just slightly, how much of this has to do with what you called the heritage media failing to interpret voter sentiment?
Well, Shay, you and I, we work pretty much in what smaller independent media. We're not part of, like a big network like a CNN or the group which owns the New York Times or even a Bloomberg or Reuters or anything like that. Now, having worked at Bloomberg, I was an editor there for the best part of a decade. You attract a certain type of journalist. They could be like someone living in a metropolitan area. Um, you know, they have quite, I'd say, moderate leanings, for want of a better description. I think what's happened is those types of journalists, and it's incredibly unfair to kind of characterize it like this, but it's actually the only way you can have clustered around, these kind of big heritage names: New York Times, Bloomberg, Reuters, Washington Post. And like, when you're inside the beltway, that's obviously the frame. You tend to, whether that type of media likes it or not, they tend to all have very similar voices, whether they're a conservative leaning network or a more moderate leaning network like a CNN, which we keep coming back to. The problem is, so I was saying, Donald Trump went on Joe Rogan, who's probably one of the biggest podcasters, broadcasters in the world. His Spotify's get 45 million downloads a month. He's not just beating these guys, he is destroying them. Now, he has MMA fighters on. He had the WWE Hall of Famer Kurt Angle on not so long ago. Huge ratings, of course. Kurt Angle also won a gold medal, and he's from Pittsburgh, and he's a regular guy. Now, Joe Rogan spoke to him for 3 hours. He had Elon Musk on for 3 hours. It wasn't combative, and it's this very kind of conversational tone, and the audience is invited to, you know, join the conversation, even though they're not deliberately part of it. But there's this, they're just two guys. Invariably, like you don't get that many females on there, but just chatting away. Now, Donald Trump went on that platform. He then went on Logan Paul, whose brother Jake's fighting Mike Tyson in a few weeks, and so that Gen X, that and I like to probably that those many of those males who have, small business, possibly blue collar, who are, they read the New York Times, and effectively the headlines and the analysis is Trump's managed to appeal to uneducated, dumb blokes. That's basically the analysis which comes through from it. It was in the Times during the week. It's incredibly insulting and incredibly, um, like arrogant upon, an industry, this legacy heritage media, which have got it wrong again. Like really what we should now be saying is every time they say the polls are close, it means the Conservatives will romp home because their polling is clearly wrong. And that's basically, whether they like it or not. I think Bloomberg, for example, I can remember very clearly, I remember the former editor-in-chief there at a dinner we had was apoplectic with rage about the thought of interviewing Donald Trump. This is before he was even going on the presidential thing. Um, he was just didn't like him, and that was that. Now, at the end of the day, you got to speak to every side, and the Fox Newses of the world. I mean, they'll never grow beyond their base, right? But Donald Trump's talking to Bill O'Reilly. He's talking. All these people are independent, and so there's this fracturing there, and there's people who are going to listen to their own point of view, rightly or wrongly. They'll go to voices which reinforce their worldview, and I mean, I think that's what's happened. Is this is really kind of the first podcast-driven election, and the Rogan influence, cannot be understated. It's quite extraordinary.
It is quite extraordinary, and you touch on the point of heritage media calling a certain cohort uneducated, and you're right, it is wildly insulting. There's other words that could be used to describe that particular cohort. And I want to touch on something you said off air before we decided to rush today's recording because we knew it was going to be a good conversation. You talked about the elitism and how the voting cohort that has asked to vote Trump in are basically sick of the elitism, corrupting politics, corrupting corporate America.
Hmm.
Yet at the end of the day, how have they not been able to disconnect that Trump is actually incredibly corrupt? He has a couple of convictions under his belt to prove it.
Sure.
He's backed by several billionaires who don't actually act in the best interests of the individual. Yet they seem to say what Joe Blogs in the street wants to hear, but they can't disconnect from the fact that these people aren't really doing anything to benefit them.
Well, this is the thing. I mean, Joe Hockey, is a former ambassador to the United States. When he was the treasurer of the Liberal Party, they came up with this idea of Betty Blacktown. She's 48, has two kids, they're basically adults, and her number one is groceries and utility bills, other things which are really hurting her. He came up with something similar. It was called Mary Milwaukee. She's 45. She has two children. One of her sons has just come back from Afghanistan. He's got PTSD, and he's trying to do a trade at the community college while she's worried, sick about how she's going to try and pay for her daughter to go to college. And she's been working at Walmart for the last 20 years, earning 15 to 20 bucks an hour. Along comes Trump, and for the first time in living memory, someone saying, you know what? I like you, and I want to fight for you. It might be the optics of what or the how that sounds. The headline of that might sound counterintuitive, but that's actually what's happening. Like they're prepared to look past someone who is, like, by all accounts, a convicted felon. I mean, his record in terms of some of the discretions, not just indiscretions, like we're talking serious, very, very serious allegations around, uh, misogyny, sexual assault. Whether or not people want to discount that, or they are very serious allegations to be aired. And so, irrespective of that, there's this kind of strongman mentality where someone who's, instead of being told by a celebrity who sits on a panel earning millions of dollars, and I'm being unfair to the likes of an Anderson Cooper here from CNN, but why on earth should they listen to the son of a multi millionaire, opine about, the ills of the world from an air conditioned studio in New York City? When they're out in the suburbs or wherever, they're in a small regional town, and they might have crafted a small business for themselves. Everything they've got, they've worked for. They don't have a first class ticket. They can't go to these exotic places, and they're sick to death of being told by media commentators who don't live the way they do. Like, I mean, I observed Trump on the campaign trail talking to small business people, Hispanics, blacks, whites, you name it. And they're saying to him, oh, I've got this frustration around this cost input or whatever. And he says the same. He goes, look, I hear you, because I was doing something not so long ago, and I had that exact same issue. Instead of feeling like this, being spoken to, the individual's elevated going, yeah, he gets it. He's talking my language. And Kamala Harris, as brilliant as her achievements are, she is a prosecutor, wildly successful career before entering politics. Um, on every key score, she's an absolute superstar. But she's pulled out, she's brought out Beyonce, Jennifer Lopez, Stevie Wonder on the piano, churning out the tune. Oprah Winfrey saying, "Get out and vote." Well, Oprah, I've got to open the shop in the morning, and I'm pretty tired, and I've got to take a special needs kid to wherever. That's what's happening in America. One person's talking to Main Street, and the other one's talking to Wall Street. And it's the Democrats talking to Wall Street, not the Republicans. They're talking to Joe Average. They're the party of the working man, and rightly or wrongly, that's what's happening.
That is an excellent way of summing up what has gone wrong. They've brought out the big dogs from LA, which, as you've pointed out, is completely different to middle America, all of the middle American states, and people who are struggling, people who are living pay to pay, week to week. So you are correct. And it is interesting to see if there will be any self reflection from the Democrats going forward of where they failed in reaching out to that everyday person. Now, obviously, I've got personal views on Trump that I'm not going to go into, but for somebody, a successful businessman, to stand in front of you and say, "But I understand your concerns," of course, that is going to win over a voter to feel like you've been heard, rather than have Beyonce and her $50 million turned around and say, like, "Oh yeah, just vote because I asked you to."
Well, that's it. But like, like you have to, if we're to peel it back to what we do, right? Like we talk to mining companies, right? That's the fundamental core. It's actually a genuine product which has application every day, whether it's a piece of gold that goes in someone's safe, or whether it's, a silver material which goes into a dental application. That's a genuine, tangible product which comes from an industry we work in, right? And for many of those tangible industries where there is product and output to make that product, it comes from the tangible. It's not some tech bro. I know we talk about Elon Musk, but he actually makes things, right? The genuine fact of the matter is this: is that you've got, really, if you want to distill it down, you've got a president who really is an unabashed fan, a president-elect of industrial goods, the economy, the real economy, as they call it. And you've got a vice president, current, who's about to finish her term as vice president, who's talking to, a very metropolitan audience. There's just not enough of those people to compete. And, if we want to peel it back here to Australia, there's genuine lessons to be learned from America. Like, the world's politically recast now. Like, Americans, there's a large cohort of Americans that are not afraid to say they don't like socially progressive issues. They're not going to cop this wokeism anymore. And that's gone, that definitely is, resonating in parts of the world. And you know what? You can talk about climate change. What was once popular 10 years ago is now an issue of, that's just a trendy woke issue. Not a serious issue, which is what we should be discussing about sustainability. How do you use the planet's resources better? It's now become a trend issue associated with one side of politics. And so for those who advocate on behalf of the environment, they've now got a further problem is the fact that half the population don't believe what they're saying.
Yes, they have. Listen, we're going to have to draw today to a close, in spite of the fact that I'm sure we could continue discussing this. All right, so we basically had the Trump bump, which is, I think, what we called it back in 2016. I'm going to dust out that phrase to call it again now in stock markets. Given that he will not be sworn in until January, do you have any sort of I hate making you put a crystal ball to this, but I'm going to do it anyway. Do you have any sort of predictions on what we're going to see over the next, say, 6 to 12 months as Trump comes in based on his campaign?
Well, he won't, if anything, he has been there before, right? So will we see the craziness which we saw towards the end? And it was nuts. Like, I mean, going onto social media platforms and markets would drop like a stone. People forget that. Like this kind of adversarial style of politicking and, this thing, this transactional way of doing things. I think, it all sounds great on the sound bites, but the practical application is that, if Joe Biden's someone who's actually incredibly talented as a foreign policy strategist and who's been in the Senate since 1972 and has seen every iteration of government in the Middle East, if he hasn't been able to move the dial, then I mean, is a New York businessman going to be able to what come out and do deals? These are very complex issues, and I kind of think some of the hubris and I think some of the swagger associated with some very difficult challenges geopolitically, and also within their own industrial framework of what they want to do, and with China, it's not going to be done with hot takes. It's the bureaucracy has to continue. The hard work of analysis has to continue. The work of trade has to continue, and it benefits all countries. So the idea of isolationist America in my lifetime by Republicans is somewhat bizarre, but again, it goes to show I grew up in the 80s and these positions would have been absolutely laughed out of the room, by Reaganites. But now it's all au fait.
It's interesting because obviously, as you pointed out, Trump's last year in government was wild. Actually, it was wild. I can't help but wonder if maybe with essentially a billionaire in his pocket, such as Elon Musk, who is interested in doing things that benefit America and himself, but interested in doing things that benefit America, if there wouldn't be some more sound direction from Trump because he does have that Elon Musk support directing issues. Maybe I'm thinking out loud and that's not a fully formed thought yet, but I wonder just with some, one or two of the so-called elites offering their support to Trump this time, if this will change his candidacy going forward.
I honestly, my only answer to that is I simply don't know, But like, I mean, the other, I suppose, the question I probably have in response is, how long can two people with? There's only so much. Any given physical room can contain so much ego, and that's a lot of ego you're talking in. And that's and then you got some of the stuff which Robert Kennedy Jr. is saying around vaccines, which is genuinely nuts. But as I said, we're at the bottom of the planet. We're opining on the world's biggest economy, but like the thing is, it does have impact. So we'll see.
We're going to have to draw it today to a close, and hopefully things have been a little bit more settled and we can get into the actual hard data of some of the numbers coming in before the year ends. Dan, I want to thank you so much for being here, and I look forward to speaking with you next week.
Sounds like a plan.